In May 1845, two British ships sailed from England on a voyage that many believed would change history forever. Their names were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. On board were 129 officers and sailors, chosen for one of the most ambitious expeditions ever organized by the British Empire. Their mission was to find the last unexplored section of the Northwest Passage. They carried advanced equipment, supplies for years, and complete confidence. None of them knew they were beginning a journey from which no one would ever return. As the expedition traveled farther north, the open ocean slowly disappeared beneath endless fields of drifting ice. Every day became colder, and every mile brought new challenges. The Arctic was unlike anything most of the crew had ever experienced. Towering icebergs surrounded the ships, while freezing winds swept across the empty landscape. Even so, spirits remained high. The officers believed they were getting closer to completing the mission that explorers had chased for generations. At this point, nobody had any reason to expect disaster. Whenever thick sea ice blocked their progress, members of the crew climbed onto the frozen surface to search for another route. They measured the ice, explored nearby islands, and looked for narrow channels that might allow the ships to continue west. It was exhausting work, but it followed the normal routine of Arctic exploration. The expedition remained organized and disciplined, and supplies were still plentiful. Every successful day strengthened the belief that the Northwest Passage was finally within reach. This photograph represents the men who placed their trust in one another as they entered one of the harshest environments on Earth. Among them were officers, engineers, doctors, carpenters, cooks, and experienced sailors. Together, they formed one of the most advanced Arctic expeditions of the 19th century. Their ships carried preserved food, scientific instruments, reinforced hulls, steam-powered engines, and everything believed necessary for success. Looking at their faces today, it is difficult to imagine that none of these men would ever see home again. The planned route took the expedition across Baffin Bay and into the maze of islands that forms the Canadian Arctic. Somewhere beyond these frozen waters lay the final unexplored section of the Northwest Passage. During the summer of 1845, several whaling ships spotted Franklin's expedition sailing confidently toward the north. The crews exchanged greetings before continuing their separate journeys. No one realized those brief encounters would become the last confirmed sightings of every man aboard HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. For years, the fate of the expedition remained completely unknown. Then, in 1859, a search party discovered a handwritten note inside a stone cairn on King William Island. The first message, written in May 1847, reported that everything was well. Around the edge of the page, another message had later been added. It revealed that Sir John Franklin had died. 24 men were already dead, both ships had been abandoned, and the remaining survivors had started marching south. By September 1846, both ships had become trapped in thick Arctic sea ice near King William Island. At first, the officers believed the situation was temporary. Other Arctic expeditions had survived frozen winters before, and everyone expected the summer thaw to release the ships. But the ice never broke apart. Weeks became months, and months became years. Instead of moving closer to their destination, the expedition remained completely frozen in place, surrounded by endless white in every direction. The second winter was even harder than the first. Food supplies continued to shrink, fuel became increasingly valuable, and sickness slowly spread through the crew. Every morning, the men woke to the same frozen landscape outside their ships. Nothing changed except their growing exhaustion. The Arctic was no longer something they hoped to cross. It had become a prison made of ice, and every passing day reduced the chances that anyone would ever escape alive. Imagine living through months of complete darkness while temperatures dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. Outside, the ice stretched to the horizon without a single sign of life. Inside the ships, the crew tried to maintain routines, repair equipment, and conserve supplies. But hope slowly faded. Another summer arrived without freeing the ships. By now, many of the men understood a terrifying reality. Rescue was unlikely, and survival depended entirely on decisions they had not yet made. In April 1848, after almost 2 years trapped in the ice, the officers accepted that the ships would never carry them home. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were abandoned where they stood. Everything the crew had depended on, their shelter, their food stores, and their last connection to civilization was left behind. The remaining 105 survivors gathered what they could carry and prepared to continue the journey on foot across the frozen Arctic. After abandoning the ships, the survivors loaded several small boats with food, weapons, and the few supplies they still had. Although the boats were built for water, they now had to be dragged across solid ice. The men hoped they would eventually reach open sea, where the boats could be launched again. Every kilometer demanded enormous effort. Freezing winds, deep snow, and constant exhaustion slowed their progress, but stopping was not an option. They believed that somewhere ahead, there was still a chance to survive. At several points, the survivors finally reached narrow channels of open water. For a brief moment, hope returned. They launched the boats and continued their journey by sea, believing they had escaped the endless ice. But the Arctic was unpredictable. Within days, drifting ice closed around them once again, forcing the exhausted crew back onto the frozen surface. Every small victory was followed by another setback, and every passing day left the men weaker than before. Behind them, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror remained trapped in the ice, exactly where they had been abandoned. The ships that once represented safety and hope slowly disappeared into the frozen landscape. The survivors could only move forward. Turning back offered no better chance of survival. They carried everything they needed on their backs and inside the heavy boats, knowing that every step took them farther from the only shelter they had ever known in the Arctic. Dragging a fully loaded boat across rough sea ice was almost impossible. The boats weighed hundreds of kilograms, and every obstacle demanded that the crew stop, lift, and pull together. Some men were already suffering from illness, while others were weakened by hunger and exhaustion. Despite this, they continued moving south, believing they could eventually reach a trading post along the back river. They had no maps of the region detailed enough to guide them, only determination and fading hope. Before long, the march became a fight simply to stay alive. More men collapsed from weakness, disease, and starvation. Those who remained strong enough carried the bodies of their friends, refusing to leave them behind whenever possible. Every death made the journey even harder for the survivors. The confident expedition that had left England 3 years earlier had become a desperate group of exhausted men, struggling through one of the coldest places on Earth, with almost no hope of rescue. Today, memorials stand in honor of the men who vanished with the Franklin expedition. Each name carved into stone represents a real person who left home believing they would return as a hero. Instead, they became part of one of history's greatest mysteries. For generations, families had no answers about what happened during those final months. Only decades of exploration and scientific research slowly revealed the incredible hardships these men had endured before their journey finally came to an end. Years after the expedition disappeared, search teams reached Beechey Island, where they made one of their first major discoveries. Hidden beneath the frozen ground were the graves of 3 young crew members, John Torrington, William Brain, and John Hartnell. Their deaths had occurred during the expedition's first winter, long before the final disaster unfolded. The carefully marked graves confirmed that the mission had begun to fall apart much earlier than anyone had imagined, raising even more questions about what had happened afterward. As more expeditions searched King William Island, they began finding scattered human remains across the Arctic landscape. Among the most disturbing discoveries were several skulls lying exposed on the frozen ground. These remains showed that many members of the expedition had died far from their abandoned ships. They had continued walking until they simply could go no farther. Even after death, the Arctic preserved the evidence, silently waiting for future explorers to uncover their final resting places. One discovery shocked historians and scientists more than any other. Careful examination of several human bones revealed clear cut marks made by metal knives. The marks matched those created while removing flesh from bone. Modern forensic studies concluded that some of the starving survivors had likely resorted to cannibalism during their final weeks. It was a heartbreaking conclusion, but one supported by physical evidence rather than legend. Hunger had pushed the expedition beyond limits that few people can truly imagine. Among the personal belongings recovered from the Arctic was a simple leather shoe. Unlike famous artifacts displayed in museums, this object represented an ordinary sailor who had once walked across the ice with the hope of returning home. The freezing conditions preserved many items for more than a century, allowing archaeologists to study details of daily life aboard the expedition. Small discoveries like this remind us that behind every historical mystery were real people with ordinary lives and extraordinary courage. Before leaving England, the expedition loaded thousands of tins of preserved food, enough to feed the crew for several years. At the time, canned food was considered one of the greatest technological advances for long voyages. However, many of the recovered cans were later found to have been poorly sealed, allowing some food to spoil. Researchers have also debated whether lead from the solder may have affected the crew's health, although its exact role is still uncertain. What is certain is that their supplies were never enough to save them. More than a century after the expedition disappeared, archaeologists recovered a brass compass from one of the wrecks. It was a small object, but it carried enormous historical value. Instruments like this confirm that the wrecks truly belonged to HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Every artifact helped researchers reconstruct the final journey with greater accuracy. Piece by piece, objects preserved beneath the Arctic ice revealed a story that had remained hidden for generations. A rifle recovered from the expedition serves as a final reminder of the men who carried it across the frozen Arctic almost 2 centuries ago. They left England expecting to make history, not become part of one of its greatest mysteries. Today, thanks to decades of exploration, archaeology, and the discovery of both shipwrecks, we understand far more about their final journey than anyone once believed possible. Yet one truth has never changed. 129 men entered the Arctic, and not a single one returned home. Some mysteries are solved in a single moment. Others take generations. The Franklin expedition took more than 170 years.